Hey y'all, it's Adrienne and we're back. Since my last recording, I've recovered from COVID and I'm feeling and hopefully sounding much better. With that said, welcome to the second episode of Inquiring Minds, the podcast that documents the semester of my inquiry in math and science class. I have titled this episode Fibers, Fingers, and Fuzzy Memories. During this module, we dug into the quirky world of crime solving, one tiny thread at a time. We went on a brief trip through the history of forensic science, performed a day-long experiment that showcased Locard's exchange principle, and with the assistance of others, showed how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be in another experiment. Today's episode is all about trace evidence, those itty-bitty clues that criminals leave behind, and the not-so-reliable eyewitness accounts that somehow still manage to crack cases wide open. Can a single hair or smudge truly make or break an investigation? And how trustworthy is that person who swears they saw it all go down, but maybe not? Get ready and join me for some fascinating facts and forensic fails. I think it is essential for me to give a short breakdown of the history of forensic science. It's truly amazing to me. I'm not going to be able to go through all of it since it is immense and goes all the way back to the BC era. It could truly be an entire podcast all on its own. I'm going to focus mainly on the topics that I will be covering in this episode. So let's go. First of all, fingerprints. Those intricate swirls that decorate the tips of our fingers, which are unique to each person. Today, they are used in identifying individuals, whether for crime solving, job, or security purposes. Would it shock you to find out that they have been used for similar purposes for millenniums? Evidence has been found that fingerprints were used by even prehistoric man for identification purposes on cave paintings. They were used in ancient Babylon on clay tablets for business transactions. In China, around the year 700 BC, fingerprints were used to seal official documents. This proves that the importance of fingerprints as unique signatures has been recognized for millennia. In 1880 AD, the use of fingerprints for identifying criminals was proposed by Scottish physician Henry Faulds. Then, in 1892 AD, the first fingerprint classification system was created by Sir Francis Galton. This is the system we still use. It includes arches, loops, whorls, and tiny irregularities known as Galton points or Galton details. It may not technically be a fingerprint, but the first recorded use of a bloody palm print for legal purposes was by a Roman attorney named Quintilian. I believe I'm saying that right. During the 2nd century AD. The case is titled Paris Palmatis, or the Wall of Handprints. The case involved a blind son accused of murdering his father as he slept to gain his inheritance. Quintilian's defense for his client was that the stepmother, who was suspiciously left unharmed, although she slept right next to the father during his murder, had done it with the plan to frame her stepson so she would inherit her late husband's estate. Quintilian used the bloody handprints left on the wall to prove that it was indeed the stepmother. He stated that the way she had to hold the sword during the commission of the murder kept blood from getting onto the palm of her hand. The fact that the bloody handprints on the wall had no blood in the center proved that the stepmother had been the one to kill her husband and stage the scene with the bloody handprints. This case is a great example of the interpretation of blood-stained patterns that we see utilized in courtrooms to this day. The idea of hair and fiber analysis was introduced in 1857 when the first forensic science report involving the scientific study of hair was published in France. This led to microscopic hair examination of the early 20th century. And the last bit of history pertaining to this episode's subjects is the establishment of Locard's exchange principle. It was established in 1910 AD by a French criminologist named Edmond Locard. It is the foundation of all forensic science. It states that every contact leaves a trace, which means that a criminal leaves and takes trace evidence at a crime scene, and this is what most modern forensic investigation is based upon. As I mentioned before, Locard's exchange principle explains that trace evidence is taken and left any and everywhere a person goes. Although it is the foundation of forensic science, it is true of every person who goes anywhere. You leave and take small clues everywhere you go throughout your day. We examined this through a day-long experiment. We wore shirts for a whole day, just going through our typical day and activities. At the conclusion of the day, we sealed the shirt in a plastic bag. The next day, using a magnifying glass or a cell phone camera zoomed in, we looked the shirt over, pinpointed, removed, and cataloged any evidence we found on the shirt. We then attempted to directly connect the evidence back to a specific time, place, and/or activity of our day. This was a very interesting experiment for me. The collection of evidence that I found on my shirt was profound. I had everything from teeny tiny feathers, directly connected to caring for my chickens throughout the day, numerous dog hairs, directly from any of my 4 dogs, sand, hay, and grass particles, all most likely from my time spent out in my yard. That is just the stuff I took from each place I went. There's no telling what I left behind. I imagine a lot of hair and fingerprints. Dr. Locard tested his principle during some of his investigations. One specific case was that of a French woman, Marie Littell, who was found dead in her parents' home in 1912. Littell's boyfriend at the time, Emile Gorbin, was the first suspect. But after questioning him and his friends, he seemed to have a solid alibi, having been out playing cards with said friends at the time of the murder. Upon examining the corpse, Dr. Locard became suspicious. There were handprints around Littell's neck. She had been strangled. Dr. Locard scraped underneath her boyfriend Gorbin's fingernails to collect skin cells and examined them under a microscope. Upon microscopic examination, Dr. Locard discovered pink dust within the samples. It was quite similar to the deceased woman's makeup. Although makeup was extremely popular with the ladies of the time, it was not mass-produced, and Dr. Locard was quickly able to find the chemist who had made this custom makeup specifically for Marie Littell. And guess what? The samples matched. After being confronted with this evidence, Littell's boyfriend, Emile Gorbin, confessed to the murder. He had set the game room clock ahead to trick his friends into corroborating his alibi. To further understand Locard's exchange principle, we learned about concept maps and created one to show the connection of the principle to the categorization of physical evidence. This included such trace evidence as glass shards, fingerprints, a coffee cup with a lipstick stain, and numerous other items. I actually used a concept map to get my thoughts organized while preparing for this episode. Now, on to the fuzzy memories. I'm sure everyone knows what eyewitness testimony is. The explanation is in the name. We studied this subject with another interesting experiment. There was a picture given to us. We had to have 2 other people to conduct the experiment. They each had 30 seconds to look at the image provided. After those 30 seconds, they were not allowed to look at the picture anymore. Then they had to describe the picture to us while we drew it, based on nothing more than their description. We were allowed to ask questions, but they had to describe it based on their memory alone. My participants were 2 of my sons, ages 15 and 10. I found it intriguing how differently my sons remembered the details of the image. They seemed to pay completely different levels of attention to different parts of the picture. The experiment was a perfect show of how unreliable eyewitness testimony can be. Eyewitness testimony is extremely powerful because many people believe that the human mind can record and save every detail of events or situations that we experience. This is why, statistically, according to police surveys, eyewitness testimony is the main form of evidence in 20% of cases. Of course, not all eyewitness testimony evidence is accurate. In fact, research shows that 75% of false convictions are caused by inaccurate eyewitness testimony. This is not to say that eyewitnesses are outright lying, but eyewitness testimony can be affected by our own personal experiences, our mental and emotional health, as in stress and anxiety, any racial biases that one may have, and even influenced memories. Some experts also include faulty police protocols surrounding eyewitness testimony as a cause for inaccurate identifications. Even without all other outside causes, our minds simply do not save memories like perfect snapshots with all details preserved. According to the National Registry of Exonerations website, there were 153 exonerations in the United States in 2023. Of these 153 exonerations, 50 of them were convictions based at least in part on mistaken eyewitness identification. That may seem like a small amount to some, but as the English legal scholar Sir William Blackstone famously wrote in 1765, it is better that 10 guilty escape than one innocent suffer. One case that relates to the statistics about eyewitness testimony is the Jathan Kendrick case out of New York. In November 1994, while walking through the Ravenswood houses in Queens, New York, Mr. Kendrick was arrested for the murder of a 70-year-old woman. Mr. Kendrick continued claiming his innocence, and there was no physical evidence connecting him with the crime. The prosecution's main evidence was the eyewitness testimony of two people: a 10-year-old boy who claimed to witness the crime from his third-floor apartment from over 100 feet away, and a man who, at first, claimed to have not seen the suspect, but later changed his statement to fit that of law enforcement that theorized that Mr. Kendrick was the assailant. With the hard work of the Innocence Project and newly discovered DNA evidence, Mr. Jathan Kendrick was exonerated and released from prison after 25 long years in November 2020. Another case is that of Mr. Ronald Cotton out of North Carolina in 1984, who was arrested and charged with 2 counts of burglary and 2 counts of rape after an assailant broke into the apartments of 2 women and sexually assaulted both. The only physical evidence against Mr. Cotton was a flashlight that resembled the one used by the assailant and rubber from Mr. Cotton's shoes that was consistent with rubber discovered at one of the crime scenes. The main evidence was eyewitness testimony. Mr. Cotton was convicted of only 1 count of burglary and 1 count of rape in January 1985, and went on to be convicted of both counts of burglary and both counts of rape in 1987. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 54 years. Mr. Cotton continued to proclaim his innocence and exhausted all of his appeals, which were unsuccessful in proving his innocence. His case received a huge break when, in the spring of 1995, the Burlington Police Department turned over all of their evidence about the case to Mr. Cotton's defense team. Included in this evidence was the assailant's semen, which the defense immediately sent for DNA testing. The results came back showing that Mr. Cotton was not the assailant. The results of the DNA test were then entered into the State Bureau of Investigation's DNA database and came back showing that the actual assailant was a convict who had previously confessed to his fellow inmate. So on June 30th, 1995, Ronald Cotton was cleared of all charges and released from prison. He was officially pardoned by the governor of North Carolina in July 1995 after serving 10.5 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. Everyone has most likely heard of Marcellus Williams and his case recently. It came out of Missouri. In 2001, Mr. Williams was convicted of the 1998 murder of Lisha Gale. There was no physical evidence connecting Mr. Williams to the crime scene. In fact, the fingerprints, bloody shoe print, hair, and other evidence at the crime scene did not match Mr. Williams. And actually, days before an August 21st, 2024 hearing that was requested by St. Louis prosecuting attorney Wesley Bell, new DNA testing on the alleged murder weapon, a knife, showed that the only DNA evidence on the weapon belonged to members of the prosecutor's office, who had mishandled the weapon while not wearing gloves after the original testing. The main evidence of the case was the eyewitness testimony of Mr. Williams' girlfriend at the time and an inmate by the name of Henry Cole, who had shared a cell with Mr. Williams in 1999. He said that Mr. Williams had confessed to the crime and shared details about the killing with him. Both eyewitnesses were noted to be convicted felons themselves and were looking to cash in on the $10,000 reward. Despite the lack of physical evidence, the new DNA testing results, the shaky eyewitness testimony, the prosecution's desire to put aside the death sentence, and Miss Gale's own family's belief that Mr. Williams was innocent and their request that his life be spared, Judge Bruce Hilton upheld Mr. Williams' conviction and stated that the death sentence would stand. After it was also upheld by the United States Supreme Court, Missouri Governor Mike Parson followed through with the execution. After over 20 years in prison and proclaiming his innocence, Mr. Marcellus Williams was executed by lethal injection at 6 p.m. Central Time on September 24, 2024. Mr. Williams' case and execution further challenges the use of capital punishment, in my opinion, but that is another conversation for another time. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Inquiring Minds, where we've journeyed through the complex and fascinating world of forensic science, from the minute fibers we leave behind to the not-so-clear recollections of eyewitnesses. Whether it's the microscopic threads of Locard's exchange principle or the powerful yet fallible role of human memory in solving crimes, this episode reminds us how both the smallest details and human perceptions shape justice. We've seen how a single strand of hair or fingerprint can provide undeniable evidence, but we've also explored the potential dangers of relying too heavily on eyewitness testimony, as illustrated by real-life cases. As we move forward, it's clear that science continues to evolve, offering new insights and challenges to our understanding of crime solving. Next time you see a piece of lint on your shirt or recall a memory from yesterday, you might just think about how these seemingly insignificant details could be the key to unlocking a much bigger puzzle. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and always seek the truth, even when it's fuzzy. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you in the next episode of Inquiring Minds, where we'll dive into yet another captivating topic. Until then, keep inquiring.